Picture this. It's 2 in the morning. The streets of London are pitch black, cold, and dead quiet. But somewhere in the basement of a narrow building on a cramped city street, a man is already awake, already sweating, already working. He hasn't slept more than 4 hours. His hands are cracked and raw, his lungs are burning, and he's got at least 6 more hours of the hardest physical labor you can imagine ahead of him, before most people even think about having breakfast. That man was the Victorian baker, and trust me, his life was nothing like the cozy little bread shop you might picture in your head. So buckle up, because today we're going back to the 19th century to find out what it was really like to be a baker in the Victorian era. And let me tell you right off the bat, this job could literally wreck your body, steal your health, and cut your life short. Sounds dramatic? Well, stick around because the facts speak for themselves. Let's get into it. First things first, who exactly were these Victorian bakers? Well, they weren't the artisan sourdough guys you see on Instagram posting aesthetic loaves at golden hour. No. These were working class men, and sometimes boys as young as 12 or 13, who woke up before the rest of the world and worked through the night to make sure London, Manchester, Birmingham, and every other booming industrial city had bread on the table by morning. And if the bread wasn't ready? Oh boy, customers showed up, and there was no wiggle room. Now here's where it gets wild. In the early to mid-Victorian period, most bakers worked in underground bakeries. Think about that for a second. Underground. Literally beneath the street level, in basements carved out of old buildings, with little to no ventilation. The ovens were fired with coal or wood, and they ran practically non-stop. Does that give you a little shiver? Because it should. The temperature in those basement bakeries could reach absolutely brutal levels. We're talking anywhere from 90 to over 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the peak baking hours. And remember, these men were working with heavy dough, carrying massive sacks of flour, and doing physical labor that would break most modern gym-goers. All of this in that sweltering, suffocating heat. And the floor, slippery. Always wet. Always a hazard. Now let me paint you a picture of a typical night in the life of a Victorian bakery worker. The shift usually started somewhere between 10 at night and midnight. That's right. When the rest of the city was winding down or fast asleep, the bakers were just clocking in. Their first job was to fire up the ovens. The big brick ovens of the era took a long time to reach the right temperature, so that process started early. While the oven heated up, the dough had to be prepared. And here's something that might surprise you. There were no fancy industrial mixers, no electric kneading machines, no shortcuts. Everything was done by hand. The baker had to mix the flour, water, salt, and yeast, and then knead the dough. But we're not talking about a cute little ball of dough for a homemade loaf. We're talking about massive batches, sometimes hundreds of pounds of dough in a single night. You know that saying, no pain, no gain? Well, Victorian bakers took that to a whole different level. Kneading that much dough was a full-body workout every single night for hours. Bakers developed incredibly strong arms and shoulders, but their joints paid the price. Wrist problems, shoulder injuries, and back pain were just part of the deal. You signed up for this job. You accepted the wear and tear. That was just life. But here's something that really puts things into perspective. What do you think was in that dough? Now, before you answer, let me tell you that the answer is sometimes a lot more than just flour and water, and not in a good way. Adulteration was a massive problem in Victorian-era food production. Bakers, often under pressure from bakery owners to cut costs and maximize profits, would sometimes add ingredients to the dough that had absolutely no business being anywhere near food. Chalk, alum, which is a type of chemical salt. Plaster of Paris. Yes, the stuff used in construction. Bone ash was also used by some to whiten the bread and make it look more appealing. The idea was that white bread was considered more refined and desirable than whole wheat, so if you could fake a whiter loaf, you could charge more for it. Now here's a question for you. Would you have noticed? Be honest, if you were a working-class Victorian family, hungry, buying bread from the neighborhood bakery every day, would you have had any idea what was actually in your loaf? Probably not, and that's exactly how they got away with it for so long. It wasn't until 1860, when the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act was passed in Britain, that there was any real legal framework to crack down on this kind of thing. But even then, enforcement was slow and inconsistent. Old habits die hard, as they say. Now let's talk about something that really hit Victorian bakers hard. And this is where things get genuinely grim. The flour dust. Sounds harmless, right? Like it's just flour. What's the worst that could happen? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. Spending hour after hour, night after night, year after year in an enclosed space filled with floating flour particles takes a serious toll on the human lungs. Victorian bakers had extremely high rates of what was called baker's asthma, a chronic respiratory condition caused by prolonged exposure to flour dust. Their lungs would become inflamed, scarred, and weakened over time. And here's the part that really stings. Many of these men had no idea that their job was destroying their lungs. They didn't have the scientific knowledge we have today. They just knew they coughed a lot, that they got winded easily, that sometimes breathing felt like a chore. They chalked it up to just being tired, getting older. Maybe the damp London air. They had no clue that every breath they took on the job was slowly doing damage. Does that not just break your heart a little? The average life expectancy of a Victorian baker was significantly lower than that of workers in many other trades. Some historical records and public health surveys from the era noted that bakers tended to look and feel older than their actual age, and that they frequently suffered from chronic illness well before reaching what we'd consider middle age today. It was a tough reality in an era that didn't exactly prioritize workers' rights or workplace safety. Speaking of workers' rights, or the complete lack thereof, let's talk about the hours, because this is something that genuinely shocked social reformers of the time. In the early Victorian period, there were basically no regulations on how long a baker could be made to work. None. Zip. Nada. Bakery owners called the shots, and if you didn't like the conditions, there was always someone else desperate enough to take your place. So bakers just worked. And worked. And worked. 18-hour shifts were not uncommon. Some accounts from the period describe bakers working 20 hours straight during peak periods, like the holidays, or when a bakery was understaffed. They would start at midnight, bake through the morning rush, clean up the bakehouse, prep for the next day, and then maybe grab a few hours of sleep before starting all over again. Now I want you to think about the last time you pulled an all-nighter, maybe studying for an exam, or finishing a work project. How did you feel the next day? Pretty rough, right? Now imagine doing that every single day of your working life, not for a laptop in a comfortable office chair, but shoveling hot dough in and out of a furnace-hot oven while standing on a wet stone floor. You know what they say. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And for these men, the thing that was slowly going away was their health. Now here's an interesting twist in the story. As the Victorian era progressed, public awareness about the conditions in bakeries began to grow. Journalists, social reformers, and public health advocates started to draw attention to what was happening in those underground bakeries. Charles Dickens himself, yes, that Charles Dickens, was among those who wrote about the plight of working-class laborers in London, and bakery workers were part of that broader conversation about labor exploitation. One particularly eye-opening development came through public health investigations. Investigators who visited bakeries in the 1860s and 1870s described the conditions in pretty alarming terms. The lack of ventilation, the extreme heat, the filthy floors, the presence of rats and insects that were unfortunately all too common in underground urban spaces. It was a public health situation that couldn't be ignored forever. Now let me ask you something. If you had walked into one of these bakeries in 1860 and seen what was going on, what would you have done? Would you still have bought the bread? Because here's the uncomfortable truth: most people had no choice. Bread was the staple food of working-class Victorian life. It wasn't a luxury or a treat. It was survival. People needed it every single day, and if that meant turning a blind eye to where it came from and how it was made, well, that's exactly what most of them did. But change was coming. Slowly, grudgingly, but surely. The Bakehouse Regulation Act of 1863 was one of the first major legislative efforts to address working conditions specifically in the baking industry. It set some basic standards. Bakeries had to be a certain height above the ground floor, ventilation was required, and there were some limitations placed on where bakeries could operate underground. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was a start, a signal that society was beginning to acknowledge that these workers deserved at least some basic level of protection. But here's where it gets complicated. Many of the worst conditions continued well past this legislation. Enforcement was weak. Many small bakeries simply ignored the rules. And bakery owners, who were often working class themselves and running tight margins, weren't exactly rolling in cash to make major structural improvements to their shops. So the situation improved slowly, unevenly, and with plenty of backsliding along the way. Now let's zoom in on something that doesn't get talked about much: the social life of the Victorian baker. Or more accurately, the lack of one. Think about it. When does a baker work? At night and in the early morning. When does the rest of society do its living? During the day and evening. This created a kind of social isolation that was unique to the baking trade. While your neighbors were going to the pub on a Saturday night, you were firing up the oven. While your family was sleeping in on Sunday morning, you were already halfway through your shift. You existed in a parallel world, one that overlapped with ordinary life only briefly, at the crack of dawn, when you slid fresh loaves into the window and the rest of the neighborhood was just waking up. Many Victorian bakers reported a deep sense of loneliness and disconnection from community life. Their friendships were largely limited to other bakers, people who shared the same strange nocturnal schedule. In a sense, they were invisible. The people who made the food that fueled an entire city, seen by almost no one. Does that hit differently when you think about grabbing a fresh loaf of bread in the morning? It should. Now, let's talk about the bread itself, because honestly, that's what this was all about. Victorian England had a complicated relationship with bread. As the century progressed and industrialization changed the economy, bread became more standardized and commercially produced. The variety and quality of bread available to working-class families was, for much of the era, not great. The most common bread eaten by working-class Victorians was a dense, often slightly grey loaf made from lower-grade flour. Wealthier families could afford finer white bread made from more refined flour, and bakeries served all kinds of customers, from the poor families who bought day-old bread at a discount to the middle-class households that expected fresh, quality loaves delivered to their doorstep by a shop boy every morning. Bakeries in Victorian England also sold other goods beyond bread: rolls, buns, pies, pastries. But bread was always the heart of the operation. It was produced in massive quantities, night after night, week after week, and every single loaf was made by hand, by men who were exhausted, often unwell, working in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint on the spot. Here's a little fun fact that might surprise you. Many poor families in Victorian England didn't actually have ovens in their homes. So on Sundays, when the bakeries often did a slower business in fresh bread, they would rent out oven space to local families. People would bring their own prepared dishes, Sunday roasts, pies, puddings, and the baker would cook them in the commercial oven for a small fee. It was a clever bit of community economics, and it made the local bakery a kind of neighborhood hub, even if most people never thought about what happened there in the dead of night. Now, by the latter half of the Victorian era, things were beginning to shift in a meaningful way. The introduction of mechanical dough mixers in some larger bakeries started to reduce the physical strain of hand kneading. Ventilation standards were being more seriously enforced in some areas, and the broader labor movement, which was gaining momentum across Britain throughout the second half of the 19th century, was starting to advocate for the rights of bakers alongside workers in other industries. The formation of bakers' trade unions was a significant development. Bakers began to organize, to share their grievances, to push back against the worst excesses of the system. They demanded limits on working hours. They pushed for safer conditions. They argued, rightly, that the men who fed the nation deserved to be treated with basic dignity. And while progress was slow and hard-won, it was real. By the end of the Victorian era, baking was still a tough trade, don't get me wrong, but the absolutely brutal conditions of the early and mid-19th century had begun to soften, at least somewhat. Legislation had teeth, public awareness had grown, and the image of the baker as a heroic, invisible laborer had started to take hold in the public imagination. There's something almost poetic about it, right? These were men who worked in the dark, so others could eat in the light. They gave their health, their sleep, their social lives, and in many cases years off the end of their lives, to produce the most fundamental food in the English diet. And for most of the Victorian era, almost nobody thought twice about it. So the next time you walk into a bakery, whether it's a little artisan shop or a big grocery store, and you pick up a fresh loaf of bread, maybe take just a second to think about what it took to get here. The technology, the regulations, the labor movements, the slow, grinding progress of human rights, all of that is baked into that loaf just as surely as the flour and water. Because the Victorian baker paid a price for that bread that we can barely imagine today. He paid it in sweat and sleepless nights and burning lungs and broken down joints. He paid it with years of his life spent underground in the heat and the dust and the noise of the ovens, making something that the world took entirely for granted. And if that doesn't make you stop and think, well, I don't know what will. Thanks for watching. If you found this look into the past as eye-opening as I did, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because history is full of stories like this one, hidden, forgotten, and absolutely worth telling.